During the age of the battleship, several of these impressive ships were lost in mysterious circumstances, blown up in safe harbors without any enemy action to justify it. In one of my earlier videos, I covered an Italian example in Leonardo da Vinci. Another example is HMS Vanguard, no, not that Vanguard, during a similar time period. However, probably the most famous of these is the Japanese battleship Mutsu, one of Japan's most powerful battleships, sister to the even more famous Nagato. In June of 1943, this proud warship suddenly and violently exploded in port. 354 survivors were pulled from the water. Over 1,100 men were lost. This explosion is something of a mystery even today. The initial assumption that it was enemy action was pretty quickly ruled out. It then came down to faulty shells and powder, or a disgruntled crewman blowing his own ship up, intentionally or not. Internal sabotage is the accepted answer in most circles, though there has been some argument that this wasn't actually the case. With the passage of time and most of Mutsu's survivors lost during the war, we'll never really know for sure. That being said, let's look at Mutsu's career leading up to that explosion. Such as it was, anyway, when she spent most of her career on training duty. Her story began almost exactly 25 years before its explosive end, on June 1st, 1918. Mutsu, the second of the Nagato class, was laid down on that day. While it wasn't known at the time, this would be the last Japanese battleship to be completed before the super battleships of the 1930s. For the time being, Mutsu's construction progressed with little issues or delays, with the battleship launched on May 31st, 1920. Her fitting out process would go quickly, with Mutsu commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on October 24th, 1921. This is all going well enough for the Japanese to this point. However, halfway across the globe, events conspire to almost kill Mutsu right as she entered service. The Washington Naval Conference and the resultant treaty saw heavy restrictions on capital ships in late 1921 going into 1922. Virtually every ship under construction was canceled and scrapped, or at best converted to an aircraft carrier. In spite of being complete and in service, Mutsu was on the chopping block. Understandably, the Japanese were rather upset at the idea of scrapping a brand new, complete and commissioned warship. It was one thing to cancel the Amagis and Tosas, another entirely to scrap Mutsu. That Mutsu was partially funded by donations from school children made it into a matter of national pride as much as the actual combat capability of the battleship. Discussions would eventually see Japan allowed to keep Mutsu in exchange for removing the old Setsu from service, along with the Americans getting to keep 3 of the 4 Colorado class, while the British got the Nelsons. Having dodged the scrapper's torch, let's look at what the Japanese got out of Mutsu real quick. Displacing about 33,000 tons at her standard load, ranging to nearly 40,000 tons at full load, Mutsu was one of the largest battleships of her day. This tonnage allowed her to carry 4 twin turrets, equipped with the Japanese 41cm, 16.1-inch gun. These were mounted in the traditional layout of the day in 2 super-firing pairs, one pair on the bow just ahead of her bridge, the other pair on the stern a bit further back than on most battleships. Supporting these were the typical casement-mounted secondary guns. In this case, no fewer than 20 14cm, 5.5-inch guns in single mounts in the hull and superstructure. Anti-aircraft weaponry, such as it was, consisted of 4 3-inch guns in single mounts. That leaves the torpedo tubes, which in typically Japanese fashion, were mounted in greater numbers than on foreign designs. Specifically, Mutsu carried 8 21-inch torpedo tubes, with 4 on either side of the ship, 2 above water and 2 submerged. As for her armor, the Nagato class moved to the all-or-nothing principle of armor protection, just like the Nelsons did in Britain. The 12-inch 305mm belt covered the most important bits of the ship. The light and medium armor of previous generations was gone. All of this was carried on a ship that could manage between 26 and 27 knots on 80,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. With the technical details rounded out, let's look at the service history now. This would prove to be one of the quieter careers out there, for all that it lasted 2 decades. After being spared from scrapping, Mutsu spent most of the interwar period in reserve, on training duty, or in various refits. This isn't to say nothing happened at all, however. Just that not much ended up happening. The 1920s, for example, were fairly boring. Notable events include the future King Edward, then Prince of Wales, visiting in April 1922. He visited both Nagato and Mutsu, alongside one Lieutenant Mountbatten. The next major event would come in 1923, with the Great Kanto earthquake on September 1st, 1923. Mutsu and her sister carried relief supplies to those impacted by the earthquake. After that, she was back to training duties, including on September 7th, 1934, sinking the old battleship Satsuma in gunnery training. For the rest of the 1920s, she would be in reserve or in various minor refits. These included trunking her forward funnel into an interesting shape, and modifying her bow to reduce spray. Beyond this, there's only one more major note in the 1920s, serving as an Imperial inspection vessel in 1927, where she carried Hirohito around for naval maneuvers and a fleet review. Then she rounded out the 1920s with yet more time in refit. As you can see, not much of note here, even by peacetime standards. The 1930s would follow much the same trend, although this decade at least started out with an interesting thing, as Mutsu got to play tugboat. On October 20th, 1930, the cruiser Abukuma collided with another cruiser, Kitakami. Abukuma came out distinctly worse from the exchange, having lost her bow up to her number 1 gun. Mutsu was assigned to tow the crippled cruiser home for repairs, which she did without issue. Then it was back to the same things she had been doing in the 1920s, up to and including another refit from February 1932 to January 1933. This saw her original anti-aircraft guns replaced with 4 twin 127mm mounts, along with 2 twin 40mm pom-poms. The bigger change in this refit was the fitting of new rangefinders to her super-firing main battery turrets, along with an aircraft catapult fitted in that open space between her aft superstructure and her aft turrets. Her aircraft capacity was increased to 3 float planes at the same time. While Mutsu would host the Emperor again in August of 1933, the next major event for her would be another refit. This refit, lasting from late 1933 to September 1936, was her major rebuild. Mutsu would receive large torpedo bulges and increased deck armor. With the fitting of these bulges, the battleship lost her torpedo tubes, which is probably for the best, because Rodney's possible hit on Bismarck aside, those tubes were more of a hazard than a benefit on a battleship. In any event, her forward funnel was also removed, as her power plant moved from 20 boilers to 10 improved models. This is also when her bridge structure was reworked into the famous pagoda style of late 1930s Japanese warships. The most important change, however, is probably the complete removal of her original turrets. Mutsu had her main battery pulled out and replaced by the turrets built for Kaga and Tosa. These were an improved model, with the result that Mutsu's guns can now elevate to 43 degrees. Furthermore, there was additional armor fitted to the turrets, making them more resistant to battle damage. Finally, 2 of her secondary guns were also removed at this point. This brought her down to 18 14cm guns, which is still a hefty broadside by all metrics. Upon returning to proper service at the start of 1937, Mutsu returned to Well, the same old peacetime duty. At least for the most part. There were a couple exceptions to the rule, as the Japanese went to war with China. First, on August 27, 1937, Mutsu carried some 2,000 men of the Japanese army to Shanghai. She was joined on this by her sister, Nagato. The two ships would stick together as, during the following week, they launched their float planes for land attack operations. From August 22nd to August 24th, Nagato and Mutsu sent their float planes on multiple bombing missions over China. When that was done, on August 25th, the two ships returned to Japan. Mutsu would take no part in further combat operations during the war with China. She would operate off the Chinese coast in 1938, admittedly, but neither her planes nor her guns were used in anger. The rest of the 1930s would be quiet, with only another refit to break the monotony. Even as World War II kicked off, that didn't change. In fact, in September of 1941, Mutsu saw another refit. Degaussing coils were fitted, her torpedo bulges were improved, and her float planes were changed out again. After this came the final preparations for poking a bear in the eye, by which I mean the Pearl Harbor attack. Mutsu would sail with the Pearl Harbor Attack Force in December 1941, though she was on distant escort duty for the entirety of the operation, something that would be her main role for the entirety of her Second World War service. Much like the larger super battleships, Nagato and Mutsu were held back from combat operations for the majority of the war. While the Congos were fighting and bleeding, the second most powerful Japanese battleships were considered too valuable to risk like that. They were preserved from most of the major surface actions. Which does mean that Mutsu's wartime service is not much to write home about. For much of 1942, she remained in Japanese waters, spending her time on basically the same things she had been doing in the interwar years. And that is more training duty. An exception was the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, when Mutsu was part of the Japanese surface force. However, she, like the other big gun warships, never once engaged the American fleet in this battle. The other exception to the rule, and the one and only time Mutsu fired her guns in anger, was the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August. Specifically August 24th, 1942. Mutsu fired her guns at reconnaissance aircraft, failed to hit anything, and would eventually withdraw with the rest of the Japanese fleet. It would be her last combat engagement. The rest of 1942 and early 1943 saw nothing of major note, other than a cancelled operation to reinforce the Aleutian campaign after the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands in March 1943. Mutsu was assigned to reinforce the Japanese positions in those cold waters, but this was ultimately dropped without the battleship ever sailing that far north. As such, Mutsu would find herself in port on June 8, 1943, playing host to 113 aviation cadets and 40 of their instructors. This would prove to be the last thing that she ever did. Around noon on June 8th, Mutsu's No. 3 turret exploded in such a violent detonation that it broke the ship in two. This was her aft superfiring turret, and the area around that magazine was completely destroyed. With the result that the forward section of the ship, some 535 feet, or 163 meters, sank almost immediately. It capsized to starboard and took most of her crew with it. The 147 feet, 45 meters of intact stern remained afloat until around 2 a.m. on June 9th. The surrounding ships, from the battleship Fuso to the cruiser Mogami, sent boats to try and pull survivors from the water. An anti-submarine alert was also put into effect, as it seemed the most likely reason for Mutsu to explode without warning. Those boats would ultimately rescue 353 survivors, with only 13 of them from the visiting cadets and instructors. The anti-submarine efforts would come to nothing, as there was never a submarine around at all. 1,121 men died aboard the battleship, including both the captain and his executive officer. Immediately, an investigation into the sinking began. Divers examined the wreck on the bottom, while fingers began to be pointed in various directions. Enemy action, be it sabotage or submarine attack, was pretty quickly ruled out. Security was too tight for the former, and no evidence of the latter was ever found. The next culprit was the Type 3 anti-aircraft shells. In absolute simplest terms, these were incendiary anti-aircraft shells for the big guns. They would be fired, creating a wall of flame and shrapnel in the face of incoming aircraft, which they proved to be terrible at, but the important part right now is that improper storage of Type 3 components had caused a fire ashore some years before. While the Japanese promptly removed these from their ships during the investigation, that same investigation ruled them out. Among other things, the propellant for the Type 3 shells apparently produced white smoke. Survivors and other witnesses reported brown smoke coming out of Mutsu's number 3 turret before the explosion. This was not consistent with the Type 3 shell, but it was consistent with a propellant fire, or just a more traditional fire for that matter. Testing of the Type 3 shells showed them to be fairly resistant to randomly blowing up in any event. And recovered charges from Mutsu's wreck were no different from those produced before and after the explosion. That left one more explanation to the Japanese investigation: internal sabotage by a disgruntled crewman. This gained traction because several survivors pointed the finger at an unnamed gunner's mate. This man was apparently accused of petty theft and scheduled to appear before court for that. The men pointing fingers at him claimed the man was suicidal and could have started a fire. Of course, this man was clearly not able to defend himself. The divers couldn't even locate his body, though the other members of his berthing space were located. The investigation ultimately decided this was the chain of events: a disgruntled and possibly suicidal man setting a fire that, intentionally or otherwise, set off the number 3 magazine and blew the ship apart. In the aftermath of this incident, the Japanese pulled off an impressive cover-up, spreading Mutsu's survivors around and denying anything wrong with her. There was even an incredibly optimistic suggestion to salvage the ship and put her back in service. In 3 months, when she was blown in half. I'm not sure if I'm impressed at the audacity of even making that claim or not. In keeping with the ludicrous nature of that claim, an attempt to dive the wreck with a mini-sub to prove it could be done saw the mini-sub snagged on a railing, almost suffocating the men aboard. Because of course, that happened. That embarrassment aside, Mutsu's wreck would remain on the bottom. Some of her was salvaged in the early 1950s, though the major salvage operations began in the 1970s. This saw most of the ship brought up, including the entire stern section. Only a 114-foot, 35-meter section of the bow, from the bridge to the number 1 turret, remains on the bottom. One of the bigger things brought up, the number 4 turret, apparently had the body of the supposed saboteur inside, at least according to Combined Fleet. Salvage operations ended in 1978, with no further operations planned since then. Now, with that done, the obvious question remains: was Mutsu's explosion actually the result of a suicidal gunner's mate? We'll never know for sure, for obvious reasons. There are various theories out there disputing this argument. From enemy sabotage, to unexploded depth charges beneath the ship, to a return to the Type 3 shells. An argument was put forward in 2009 that a fire next to the magazine heated it up enough to set off propellant charges. The most common argument still remains the suicidal man, however, although there is some debate there in survivor interviews after the war. They claim the man wasn't suicidal and was actually setting the fire as a diversion so he could escape the ship. However, they also believe he failed to exit the magazine before it exploded. This might have been based on his body not being located until Turret 4 was pulled up. Ultimately, though, it's going to remain a mystery. One could argue that there's some similarity to the turret explosion on USS Iowa, similarly blamed on one disgruntled sailor. Was it possible that a man was scapegoated because he couldn't defend himself? That's definitely possible. But again, we'll never know for sure. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.